Today we're going to be talking about Dark Souls 3, and this is a review that a lot of people have been waiting for many different reasons. First of all, because I've now played every major game from Software, and it'll be easy for me to kind of compare them in a review atmosphere. Second, because I actually played this game a little earlier than most, taking advantage of a loophole through the Japanese Xbox Live, and I was able to start playing this game back in mid to late March, and I did a full playthrough of the game over the course of the month, so I really had a big chance to let this seep in. But in addition, being that I played it on the Xbox One, I also was able to kind of experience some things about the performance of the game on that console that many others who played on the PlayStation 4 and the PC were able to avoid, and I obviously need to warn people about that too. I'll be covering all of that in this review, so here we go. Unlike Part 2, Dark Souls 3 actually serves as a direct sequel to the original game. There's many references to Kindling the Fire, the Lords of Cinder, and all of the plotline from that original classic from way back when. So you're going to see a lot of parallels and a lot of returning characters in this game. You're going to actually be fighting enemies that are incredibly similar to things that you fought way back in Dark Souls 1. And I do have to say that that is one of the coolest things about the game, being that you can get lots of references in the lore and even in major boss fights if you've been paying attention all this time. To see this series come to a conclusion and come full circle in this way was pretty awesome. Improvements over the previous Dark Souls are very apparent from the get-go. Obviously, being on current-gen consoles for the very first time, the graphics of the game have taken a major overhaul, with more detail than ever before, with more enemies on the screen than ever before, and the same kind of chaotic gameplay that you're to expect, only with all the little bells and whistles of a modern gaming console. And I do have to say, I was very pleased with the fact that the things finally looked really good. In previous Dark Souls games that I'd played, it always seemed like the graphics were kind of nerfed in order to fit in as much as they wanted into these games. Not so much, at least, in regards to the detail of the graphics of Dark Souls 3. I'll talk a little bit later about the frame rate, but that's another issue entirely. In fact, in regards to the graphics, one of the really cool things is that all during your playthrough of Dark Souls 3, you're able to see out into the distance and actually look at areas of the game that either you've already covered and conquered or that you're going to reach in the future. It's really neat how all of these things tie together. In previous Dark Souls games, you kind of see things out in the background and they just be that, the background that you may or may not ever get to. But in Dark Souls 3, just looking at attention to the detail actually will give you a preview of what's to come and will also tie together all the previous areas that you've been to. Never before in a From Software game has this been done. It's really neat, and it's a really cool way to experience the improved graphical engine. Combat in Dark Souls 3 is pretty much commonplace and what you would expect for the series, including light attacks, heavy attacks, backstabs, parries, blocking with shields, equipping armor, and equipping various different kinds of weapons for different kinds of attack strings. Yes, the dodge roll returns. The major addition here is the special ability imbued with each weapon. Every single weapon has a special kind of attribute, whether it's a special attack, whether it's a kind of a buff to your character. Every weapon has something completely unique about it that uses the new FP bar to take effect. Now you say a new bar, well, how do you recharge that bar after you've used it? Well, not only are there Estus flasks in this game to recharge your health, but there's also new Ashen flasks, which will allow you to recharge that FP bar and use your abilities more often. So for the first time, you actually have to micromanage 3 completely separate bars. It's a new interesting system. It certainly adds a new wrinkle to the Dark Souls gameplay. In addition, there's the new Embering system. By using an Ember, your character gets increased health and also opens up the multiplayer gameplay of the game. It allows people to invade your game, it allows you to invade other people's games, and opens up that whole multiplayer aspect. If you don't Ember, you choose to have reduced health, but that aspect will never really interfere in your game, so it's really completely up to you whether or not you want to participate in this new system, and I really like that about the game, because in particular, I just wanted to have it be more straightforward and not have those invasions constantly bothering me. As you start to play Dark Souls 3, you'll realize something. If you played Bloodborne last year, it actually starts off very similar to that game. You'll be in towns where townspeople have been corrupted and they're kind of transforming, almost like the kind of symbiotic creatures that were in Bloodborne, and it is very reminiscent. Now, originally when I did a first impressions video for the game, I actually even called this out and said, what's going on? Why does it seem to be so similar to Bloodborne? I thought that this was supposed to be Dark Souls, but I am very pleased to say that about 5 to 6 hours into the game, it completely flips on its head. You'll start fighting a wide variety of creatures, all kinds of wild and wacky things that you've come to know from the Dark Souls universe. The mutated monsters, typical horror-style creatures, giant bosses, huge demons, everything comes into full play in this game, and it very much is a wide variety of stuff that does not leave you wanting. In fact, I will go as far to say that in all the Dark Souls games that I have played, that this one pretty much has the most cohesive universe along with the variety. When you're playing Dark Souls 3 and you're going from area to area, they don't seem like they're disjointed or disconnected like a lot of the places in previous Dark Souls games have. In this case, it seems like you're going through an organic world from one area to the next, from one town to a small settlement to a cave to a bog to a volcano. And as you go through all these areas, they really do feel like they would be naturally connected. That's something cool and different that's never been done in a Dark Souls game before. There's going to be a wide variety of environments, a wide variety of enemies, and by the end of the game, you should feel fulfilled. At least I certainly did with the amount of challenge that was in the game. Speaking of difficulty, let's address that. Dark Souls 3 is certainly no easy task to beat. They're gonna throw everything at you but the kitchen sink, including mobs of enemies that come around corners when you least expect it, traps that are set up for beginners who aren't expecting if they chase down one hallway after one enemy that 3 others won't jump out. You're gonna have cheap instant deaths, you're gonna have collapsing floors, you're gonna have explosions, projectiles coming out of the sky unexpectedly, everything that you've come to know and love from Dark Souls 3. But I am pleased to say, even not being a great Dark Souls player, that if you stick at it, if you stick with it, if you learn from your mistakes, if you take the time to learn the combat engine, there's nothing really overly difficult in Dark Souls 3 that's not beatable, maybe with the exception of 1 or 2 optional bosses near the end of the game that may challenge newcomers and people who really aren't adept at the combat engine. Everything is pretty much passable, and I think that most people should be able to progress through the game, albeit it might take some people longer than others to beat the game, but I think everyone should be able to do it. I'll be honest, I think that this was the most challenging of all of the games. Keep in mind, though, that I never really legitimately played Dark Souls 1, so I don't have a frame of reference there. But in comparison to other games recently, like Dark Souls 2, or Demon Souls, or Bloodborne, I think I felt the most level of challenge with this game. Of course, I also didn't grind at all. And keep in mind that if you are playing a game like Dark Souls 3 and you're finding it too hard, you can always take the time to do some grinding against repetitive enemies, level up tons of times, and that could be your artificial crutch. This is the first From Software game I chose not to do that, and the fact that I was still able to make positive progress on every single time I played the game, and really it was only a couple bosses near the end of the game that got me stuck. I can report that the game is fair, balanced, and a lot of fun. Overall, my playthrough took around 40 to 45 hours of gameplay. Of course, keep in mind that I went and looked for every hidden item, I found all the hidden areas of the game, I took on every single boss, including even the optional ones that you don't have to fight, and so really it was more of almost a completionist run of the game when it came down to it. I could definitely see people who are better than the game than me beating it between 20 to 30 hours, but even then, that's a hefty amount of gameplay for a $60 release in this day and age. Keep in mind, there's a whole multiplayer aspect to the game, including invasions and PvP, that I really didn't even delve in this time around, so really I can't even factor that into my review. I'll tell you this, I know it exists and I know it's probably good, although in previous Dark Souls games there's been lots of issues with backstabs and lagginess in the multiplayer, but just as a single player game, this game stands atop the pile of releases of the past few years, and I would probably say, honestly, I liked it just as much as Bloodborne last year, and I know that's a big statement to make because Bloodborne was a new IP, but this was a good way to send off the Dark Souls series, in my opinion, and I very much enjoyed it. Of course, I've kind of heard the opposite from some people, and some people have even come out and said that they think this game is too easy. I think that's ludicrous. I think what happened here is From Software did actually have some positive changes. For example, the bonfires in Dark Souls 3 are not necessarily more plentiful, but you can unlock shortcuts to bonfires a lot more easily than you were able to in previous Dark Souls games. A lot of times, the paths that you need to take are a lot more straightforward, rather than having to find the bonfire behind an illusory wall to be able to save your game. None of that exists here. It pretty much is very fair and balanced, and I really don't think there was any part of the game where I had a tough time if I died repeatedly having to go from another bonfire that was nearby to get back to where I was, and that's a very good thing. The last thing you want to do is have to replay several minutes of gameplay because you died at a hard boss and have to redo that as a gauntlet to get back to that boss. That's really not that necessary in Dark Souls 3, and I think that's a very good positive addition. But with all that good, you've got to take the bad. But honestly, I think the bad things that I experienced during my playthrough of Dark Souls 3 were console-specific, being particularly that I played this on the Xbox One. During 3 particular boss fights, the frame rate of Dark Souls 3 dipped below 30 frames per second, sometimes into the teens, which actually caused the game to slow to a crawl and made it impossible to actually react to what was going on screen. In fact, a lot of the times, the inputs of rolling or blocking were just massively delayed. In one instance, I was actually fighting a boss, and the game game completely froze for about a second, proving that this version or port of the game does not function properly on the Xbox One. Now, I'll be honest here, the same issues were actually present on the PlayStation 3 version of Dark Souls 1, and I remember the same kind of thing happening, but the difference here is, this is how many years later? How can you sell a game in 2016 and have the same issues that you had with the original entry years ago, even though you're using newer hardware? It's completely and utterly unacceptable, and I'm gonna be honest with everyone. If you're gonna play Dark Souls 3, and you have the option to play it on either PlayStation 3 or the PC in particular, where apparently you can get full 60 frames per second, do it. Stay away from the Xbox One version of this game. It is by far the inferior one, and not even during the boss fights. I tested during gameplay and noticed more input delay than I've ever experienced ever in a From Software game before. In fact, I just played Bloodborne last year, and that had almost no input delay. This game had significant. So it's absolutely ridiculous. It's unacceptable. The Xbox One version of this game should not have been sold like this, and quite honestly, I'm pretty pissed that everyone got ripped off. So for me, Dark Souls 3 was kind of a mixed bag because I played it on the Xbox One. The new graphical engine being overhauled and having more detail than ever before was amazing. The fact that you could look off into the distance and see a connected world that really felt organic, unlike the previous Dark Souls games, was really outstanding. The level design, the enemy design, the boss design, the tried and true Dark Souls gameplay returning with a new twist with the new weapon abilities, the bonfires being more plentiful and or easier to find so you don't have to backtrack as much, but the also ever-present difficulty of Dark Souls still being there were all massive positives in my opinion. But I have to pair that with the frame drops, the frame rate issues, the input delay, and the input blatant drops that happen during gameplay during particular parts of the game that are not acceptable in the present day. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm going to give Dark Souls 3 two separate scores. I'm going to give it an overall score dependent on the game itself, the engine, the art design, and what I felt they did with the game, and then I'm going to give it a score to the Xbox One version. I think that overall Dark Souls 3 is one of, if not the best in the series. I really would say it's between 1 and 3. 2 is probably the worst in all of them in my opinion after really weighing and balancing everything. And it's hard for me to say because I haven't really legitimately done a full playthrough of Dark Souls 1. I really had my hand held through it when I played it that second time. But I'm going to say that Dark Souls 3 does everything right. It's a good send-off to the series. It ties all the plot lines together. It's really well done. I'm actually going to say Dark Souls 3 is a 9.5 out of 10. And before someone says, but Phil, years ago you rated Dark Souls 2 a 9.5 out of 10. In retrospect, right, when better games are released, scores will adjust. So I have to say that Dark Souls 2, for me now, is probably around an 8.75 in comparison with the stuff that I did in Dark Souls 3. I think it actually lowers its ranking overall in the From Software games. But if you want me to review Dark Souls 3 on the Xbox One, I seriously, with those input delay issues, the frame drops during boss fights, in good conscience, I can't give this game more than a 7.5 out of 10. This is the worst port. There's no reason that you should play it unless you absolutely only own an Xbox One and want to experience this game. They really effed it up. I don't know how it's acceptable that you pay the same amount of money for a game that is not equal to other ports. I am very disgusted at the whole situation, and hopefully From Software learns their lesson and actually releases equivalent versions in the future. So Dark Souls 3 for me, overall it's a 9.5 out of 10 and probably my most favorite From Software game in recent memory. However, the Xbox One port being inferior only gets a 7.5. Well, that's it for the Hateful Truth review, everyone. I sure hope that you enjoyed it, and if you did, please consider giving the video a like here on YouTube, as well as sharing it with your friends. In addition, please check the video description, where you'll find things such as a link to my entire Dark Souls 3 unedited playthrough. In addition, there's an Amazon Associates link that helps us if you use it. And finally, you'll see a link to our Patreon at patreon.com/DarksidePhil, where your pledges directly help the efforts for me to keep doing this full time. Thanks a lot, everyone, for watching. I'll see you next time on The Hateful Truth. Peace out.